So I was glad for the extra week because I realized as I prepared this that this needed to be a preliminary lecture, following up on what I did last time with Michael Wise's main proposal for dating and so forth. And even the time before that, we discussed some of his material. And what's interesting about Michael Wise and Robert Eisman is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were released in the 1990s, 1991 and 2, Wise and Eisman collaborated. So for me, the two most interesting Dead Sea Scroll scholars wrote a book together, and they shared the unpublished scrolls and became friends. I'm going to say a lot of personal things, so this is not to be shared. We upload it to the course page, but I'm trusting you here. I'm not going to say anything nasty or anything, but I want to tell you about my relationship with Robert Eisman, which is very, very close. I've spent hundreds of hours with Robert Eisman. I know him really well, and I met him at such a wonderful time as the scrolls were being released. And one of my favorite texts in the Hebrew Bible, and this is not an accurate exegesis of it, but it's how I read it. Remember your creator in the days of your youth, except the word creator is actually plural. Remember your creators in the days of your youth. And all the Bible scholars say, well, it's just a defective spelling of the Hebrew word, and it still means God. But at the end, it says, fear God and keep his commandments. And in between, it describes old age. Remember, when the keepers of the house tremble, and when your legs are bent and so forth, and your hair is white like the almond tree. But I always have read that as remember your creators. And you've seen how I honor my teachers. I take one of the 10 commandments, honor your father and mother, in a more generic way. Honor those who made you, you see, obviously parents, father and mother. But in the academic world, we refer to our Doktor Vater. It's usually spoken in German, a Doktor Vater. And it's very common. We don't normally translate it because it would sound weird. My doctor father. Oh, your father's a doctor? Wow, that's interesting. But what it means is your academic creator. So Jonathan Smith is my Doktor Vater. But I've got other Vaters, and that would be Norman Perrin, Robert Grant, and I would put Robert Eisman up there. He seems like a ferocious lion, but he's as sweet as honey when you get to know him. He's a dear, precious person. But he's been so maligned and so abused by the establishment that he's toughened up. The Sabra, right? Prickly on the outside and sweet on the inside. So he's a sweet person, but pretty ferocious too. So that interview that I put up that I think many of you have watched, wave your hand if you watched it. Just about everything he said about Paul, I disagree with in that video. But I understand who his enemy is and who he's speaking of. I just don't think it's Paul. I think it's what became of the movement under Pauline influence. But I make a big differentiation between the historical Paul, as I understand him, and Pauline theology as it developed. And the big difference is, for Paul, is a lack of understanding of the acute, dire apocalypticism of the 40s, 50s, and 60s that Paul lived through. You've got to always read Paul that way. If you enshrine Paul into the theology of the church and then add the pastoral epistles and the Deutero-Pauline letters and the book of Acts, then you're not getting Paul, the real guy. And to some extent, when Eisman talks about Paul, he's talking about I would say, a caricature of what Paul became, but there's a validity to it because that is, in fact, where the church went. The church went with the Augustine. It's called by, let's see, was it Stendhal, I think, who wrote the famous article, Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the Western World, or the Paul of Luther. It's the Paul who thinks that the Jesus movement is primarily about your personal internal guilt and salvation rather than the apocalyptic transformation of the entire cosmos into what it was meant to be, the new creation, which Paul, remember in my book on Paul and Jesus, I think I have a chapter, I don't know if I called it this, but I call it this a lot when I talk, Paul's greatest idea. That's Paul. And Augustine and Luther don't even dwell. For them, Paul is justification by grace through faith, the Reformation cry. And Augustine's the same way. How does God save sinners? And actually, the original Paul, I think, the historical Paul, he certainly believes through the grace mediated through the death of Jesus, one's sins are forgiven. But his big idea is how a mortal human being, Jesus in this case, has been transformed into this life-giving spirit, this eternal being, the firstborn of a family to come of these entities, let's call them, these beings that he calls in Greek the sons of God. It's masculine, but it's really not masculine. It makes its way into Luke, maybe through Paul, but when Jesus is asked about the resurrection, Mark has this, but Luke elaborates it in a beautiful Pauline way. When he's asked about the woman with the 7 husbands, remember the trick question? Whose wife will she be? Notice how it's framed from the male point of view. Whose wife will she be in the resurrection? Because you could just say, well, I guess a woman could have 7 husbands. They were all her husband, so she could have her own male harem, right? But the question is, whose wife who's going to get her? And Jesus says, you err, not knowing the scriptures. In the age to come, there'll be no marrying or giving in marriage. And then he elaborates and says, the beings will be like angels. They won't die anymore. Being children of the resurrection, he calls it, sons of the resurrection. And that's Paul's big idea. But my guess is Jesus might have had that too, because it's also in Mark. Of course, Mark could have been influenced by Paul. So anyway, I'll get into that a little bit when I get into Eisman's ideas, because he thinks Paul's the liar, basically, mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that's my introduction to Eisman. I've got some slides we're going to go through, but I just want you to know about that personal relationship. So in 91, 92, I stayed a month at Qumran with him and my students and a whole group. Michael Bajent was there, who wrote Holy Blood, Holy Grail. It was great to be with him. A couple filmmakers were there. A lot of people came. And we did an archaeological survey of all the caves from Qumran. Yeah, we did start at Qumran down to Ein Gedi. And we surveyed over 1,000 caves in a month and broke into teams. Each team had a kilometer, and each team had about 6 people with climbing equipment. And one of the kilometers was mine. I know my kilometer. Every time I pass it on a bus or a car now, I go, that's my kilometer. So the Kidron goes all the way down. That's where Mar Saba is, the monastery in the Kidron, where Morton Smith found the manuscript of Clement of Alexandria that has those quotes from what he calls Secret Mark. So I got to know him then, but over the years, I've met him many, many times. I've met him in California, have worked with him and so forth. So let me start my share with that personal introduction. Okay, I'm calling this the Dead Sea community. Notice not going with Essene or Yachad or anything really. The Dead Sea community, and I mean the Qumran community. And late Second Temple Judaisms. The S is purposely put on. It sounds odd, but it's an attempt that many of us as scholars try to stress to our students that Judaism, like Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, is not a monolithic whole, and it wasn't in the first century. Late Second Temple generally means from the Maccabees on to I would usually it's 73 with Masada, but in some ways you should go right to Bar Kokhba. The reason is Yohanan ben Zakkai survives 70. He's the rabbi, and then you have Rabbi Akiva. He's past 70. So I think because Yohanan ben Zakkai, who essentially is head of the Pharisaic Academy, and then Akiva, the great rabbi of the early second century, go on down to the time of Hadrian. It's not really Second Temple because the temple's gone, but it's not, it's gone and it's not gone. It's really gone when Hadrian rebuilds the whole city, calls it Aelia Capitolina, dedicates it to Jupiter or Zeus. Then it's gone, right? And the rabbis go up north and actually they go to Sepphoris, they go to Sfat, they go to Tiberias primarily. And then you begin to get the Mishnah and so forth. So that's what we mean. So we're talking about a period, particularly though, we want to focus on right in the middle of from the Maccabees to 70. And our guy, Jesus of Nazareth, that most of us have been drawn to this stuff through, not everybody, but most of us, Jesus is the reason, as we say, because he's that Jew that we begin to study and realize we want to know more about him. At least that's how my life went. So as you start to talk about it, we have sectarian textual references. So you start with the text of the scrolls themselves, and you've done that in the course. Some of you are from the Mark course. I hope this will encourage you to sign up for the Dead Sea Scroll course as well. But my purpose in that course was to lead you into some of the main parameters of standard Dead Sea Scroll studies with my take on things, obviously, because I'm presenting it. So we have those things in terms of like, who are these people? Could we locate them? Could we name them? Do we know them from other sources? What did they think? What did they believe? And so forth. You've got to go to the text, and we've done that quite a bit. The archaeology of Qumran, the settlement, comes up quite a bit. And Jody Magnus has written the book on the archaeology of Qumran. And I think her conclusions are pretty well accepted. And I'll talk about the archaeology in just a minute. This is just an overview. Then we have classic references to the Essenes, primarily Josephus, book 2 of the war, but some references in Pliny, as well as Philo, and even references in Philo to the Therapeutae sometimes are brought in as well. And there's a few other stray references. Joan Taylor has done the most work on those classical sources. You can look up her work. Joan Taylor, great Qumran scholar. So I want to give you the summary of what the archaeology is because it's changed considerably. And it's moved in the direction of Michael Wise's textual analysis, meaning when was the flourishing of the movement and when did the teacher most likely live and die? the archaeology, strangely, seems to fit that. And Wise, of course, didn't know that when he began to develop his theories. Classic references. Okay. Now, what could you get from the classic references? We cover them in the course. I even print them out for you in Whiston's translation of Josephus. They're certainly useful, and people go through and, make the parallels and so forth. But it's like using the book of Acts for Paul. I think it's a very similar, if I could make that analogy. I want to know about Paul. I'm going to study Acts first. No, you want to know about Paul, read First Thessalonians first, please. Stick with Paul. And then read the Corinthian correspondence, and then read Galatians and so forth. And finally, you can read what somebody else said. So when you read what Josephus says, you've got to keep two things in mind. First, in the war, he's writing it for the Emperor Vespasian. He's living in the former palace of Vespasian in Rome. He likes the Essenes. So if he knows the dirty secret about the Essenes, that they're an apocalyptic militant group that hate Rome and want it overthrown, he's not going to say that. Now, we usually say, well, they probably just died out in 70 or 73. Some of them might have gone to Masada, but eventually they die out. Well, of course, they die out in terms of a mainstream group of Jews, but the Jesus movement, especially in its Jamesian form, right? I'm going to just use James, even though his name is Yaakov. That's a battle that we've lost. We're never going to get people to call James anything but James, because nobody will know what you're talking about. So the Jamesian movement is in some ways Essene, isn't it? I mean, depending on what you mean by Essene. I always tick off that list of parallels when I talk to people. You've heard me do it even the opening of the course. On YouTube, apocalyptic, messianic, preparing the way in the wilderness, right? The references are useful, but I think Josephus wants to protect them. He does. And that's probably why it doesn't mention James, Jesus, and John the Baptizer in the war. He should have mentioned them in the war, but they're in the Antiquities. Well, he's writing the Antiquities in the 90s, and those guys are gone. They're dead. Right? Vespasian's two sons successively take over, Titus and Domitian. And Josephus finally writes his magnum opus. And when he gets to this period, he brings in what he's never brought in before: Jesus, James, and John. And even though the Jesus version in Greek is problematic, but it can be recovered, I would refer you to John Meyer on that. He has a whole appendix. John Meyer writes many volumes. This is his volume 1, Marginal Jew. He has a nice section on lots of things like the testimony of Josephus to Jesus. So we use the classic references. Then we have paleography and carbon-14 dating, AMS dating for the scrolls. This doesn't tell us as much as we had hoped. And then we have the John, Jesus, James movement. I like to call it the 3 J's. So we got the 3 J's, and we got, and so to talk about the Dead Sea Scroll community and late Second Temple Judaisms, you can see the complexity of trying to consider all of these things at once. Now, because there are these archetypes that people often use to say things are fiction, by that I mean, you can say they're archetypal hero things, and the hero always has a protagonist, and then, you get different, and groups always break up and so forth. You get this sort of patterns, you could call it, if you don't want to call it archetypes. Archetypes might be a little bit too Eliadian or something, but it is interesting that if you just take these characters, the teacher, the good guy, the liar, was a good guy but broke away. or sort of part of it, but representing a apostatized version, and an outside wicked opponent. Then you start playing around with these things, and it becomes a kind of a set piece that you can put down. Like I could put this down on the Branch Davidians in 1990. David Koresh is the teacher. Mark Bro is the liar, who is his main confidant and most brilliant student, who broke off and opposed him. And the government and the FBI are the wicked ones who come to destroy him. You see what I'm doing here? So what happens, I'll give you two examples. One would be Eisman and one would be Barbara Teering. Barbara Teering died, I think, in 2015, the Australian scholar, very renegade scholar. Eisman and Teering are the two renegade scholars of Dead Sea Scroll fame, loved by the public, but the scholarly establishment does not accept their positions at all, probably for good reasons and bad reasons. The bad reasons are they don't even give them a hearing, especially in the case of Eisman. I think Eisman is much more weighty than Barbara Teering, but she did have her point. She just went kind of crazy with it, in my opinion. I've never met her. I don't know her. But she claimed John the Baptizer is the original true teacher and Jesus is the apostate who taught smooth things. Well, that seems to fit. Just about everybody I know says, well, John probably was more strict, right? He's more austere. He's more ascetic. And Jesus, he's liberal. My yoke is easy, my burden is light. And in fact, we have the Mandeans who say something very similar to that. You can go to James. James is the teacher, the good guy, and Paul is the one teaching the smooth things. And Eisman just kind of puts a line through Jesus like, we don't know. We don't know about him because everything's coming through Paul, the liar. And then when you get to the wicked priest, generally it seems to be the Jerusalem establishment. So who are the bad guys? The outside bad guys. Well, Maccabees traditionally, because they're like liberal and they're Hellenistic and so forth, and they've corrupted everything. Well, the Maccabees, they can be Pharisees, they can be Sadducees, depending on what period you're talking about. Maybe the Zealots are the bad guys because they're going to be zealous for the law. Are those the kind of people that you get in the book of Acts that seem to cluster around James, although according to Acts, James doesn't fully agree with them because he allows Gentiles in, but they're maybe hotheads and so forth, and maybe even willing to go to war. And then the Sadducees are usually seen as running the temple, but as several scholars have pointed out, the ideas of the scrolls in many ways reflect Sadducean legal or halakha materials like MMT, their rulings, in other words. So even though this is interesting to play around with, I just want you to see how it can be kind of fluid. You can pick your good guy, your bad guy, and your outside enemy and come up with different models. So in terms of getting into Eisman's idea, the big flaw for most scholars is he wants to put all the main activity, particularly in the Habakkuk Pesher, where you've really got references to the teacher and the wicked priest coming to his house of exile and all of that stuff. You get biographical material even after the teacher's dead and they're thinking back. Eisman wants to say that that's first century material. So let me pause here and talk about a couple of sources. The Meaning of the Dead Sea Scrolls by Vanderkam and Flint. This is by far the best handbook on the Dead Sea Scrolls. If you want the general take of the establishment, which is not bad, by the way. I'm not saying the establishment is bad. Vanderkam is a friend of mine. Peter Flint passed away tragically. He's gone now, but I love him and he was a wonderful scholar. You probably heard him lecture at bar conferences over the years if you go back that far. So this is in your bibliography, I'm sure, on the course pack, but it's got a foreword by Emmanuel Tove. It's a beautiful book. And it covers everything. It covers all the carbon dating results, all the paleography results, all the different theories. It's a very comprehensive book. So this, along with a translation, and I recommended Vermesh because it's Penguin paperback and it's cheap, and for the course, it seemed like the best one to recommend. So I just want to mention that. But as far as dating, and you've got this in the course, Michael Wise's Journal of Biblical Literature article is the best. He reflects it in his book, but it's absolutely a masterful article. And if you remember, those of you who read it, remember what he does. He says, why don't we look at all identifiable references to historical events and figures throughout the Dead Sea Scrolls and see what kind of chronology we get? We're basically, if we're doing Eisman, we're discussing, are we in the 1st century BCE? And we should understand everything in terms of those events. And we know a lot about it from our sources, archaeology as well as Josephus primarily. Or are we in the 1st century CE, the time of Jesus, right? So where are we? Notice you're moving 100 years. We should be able to determine that. I think Michael's article is convincing. So I'm going to have a problem with Eisman from the start, you see? Because what Wise would say to Eisman, remember, they wrote their book together when the scrolls were released. They're not bosom buddies, but they cooperated, and they're both good scholars. Wise would say, is it even possible that the movement flourishing in the 1st century would never mention any major event or character from the 1st century? Now, Eisman would come up with some, but you might start with Herod the Great. That would be pretty big, right? And if remember on the article, he has the chart and so forth, and it's also in his book. It's also in his First Messiah book, which, as you know, I consider to be overall the best book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, he argues a very sustained singular case for dating the teacher, the flourishing of his movement, with the paleographical evidence and the historical evidence and everything else. And he uses the Thanksgiving hymns in a beautiful way. And it's called Attention to the Thanksgiving Hymns. Now, the basic kinds of things that he uncovers would not have to be tied to the 1st century BCE or CE. They could float because they're kind of generic. But I really, if you haven't read that yet, you should read it. Classic sources already mentioned. Archaeology, Jody Magnus has a book. Jody's views are covered in the chapter on archaeology here very favorably. And so if you get this book, you've got paleography, archaeology, dating, you've got all kinds of data with footnotes and references, and you're in good shape as a non-specialist reader. So here's what Jody did in a nutshell. That makes it easy to remember. The classic dating is by Father Roland DeVoe, right, who excavated Qumran. And he said the settlement started in the Iron Age, 8th to 7th century, and Jody agrees with that. Okay. It wasn't built by the sect. It was some sort of a desert fortress or something in the Iron Age, but nothing like it looks today, as we've now uncovered the whole complex. Then he had period 1A, 1B, and 2. You can see the dates. 1A has virtually no coin evidence and very doubtful any pottery evidence. So to make it a period of habitation is a real problem. So why would DeVoe do that? Remember in the course, with the Damascus document, you read the opening of the Damascus document, and you read that 390 years after Nebuchadnezzar, and then we wandered like blind men groping for the way for 20 years, and then God raised up a teacher, that's 40, and so forth. Now, you can either say those are ideal dates, so you're not going to get anywhere with them by doing math. I would say they're not ideal dates. I think they're, I mean, 390 sounds ideal, but I think they're working it out to fit. Because remember, after the fact, if you're expecting prophecies after the fact, you can look back and say, wow, look how that fulfilled this or that. Just ask anybody that's got an interpretation of Daniel or something like that. After the fact, they think they can look back and say, oh, that was Jesus, because Artaxerxes' decree was in 457, and if you add, the 70 weeks, or at least the 69 weeks, you come to that period and so forth. So, but in terms of archaeology, there's no reason to think that the group is there. Suddenly, this is still BCE, you get a flourishing with 81 original texts being dated by paleography. In other words, this is think of it like this, a flat line, and then all of a sudden, like this. This is DeVoe, and he claims that there was an earthquake in 31, and they abandoned the site for 30 years and came back after Herod's death in 4 to 68. There's a whole abundance of coin evidence for this period here, 100 down to 31. And when you go up to Michael's article, that his flourishing in terms of the names and the habitation at Qumran, even if there is an earthquake and a fire, this was DeVoe's dating, is this very period. And then 4 BC to 68 can be period 2. It is, they are out there. But if the teacher died maybe around, say, 70, which Wise claims, 30 years into this period, and it's a Sadducean movement opposed to the smooth things of the Pharisees, is Michael's basic argument, with a different halakhic interpretation. But Michael on page 243 has a brilliant idea of his book, this book. And be sure you look at the footnote where he lists the text. He actually lists the text. He said, why don't we count copies of texts? Like, how many copies of the community rule do we have? How many copies of the Damascus document do we have? Well, there you mainly just have the ones from Cairo, but you have fragments in K4, right? So how many? And I went over this last time, but look what he comes up with. From 75 to 65 BCE, you have 5 texts that we can, these are paleographic datings primarily, because radiocarbon dating we can talk about in the Q&A if you want, but it's very problematic because of contamination. 65 to 55, you have 9 texts, 5 old, they're still using these, but 4 new ones. They got to update. 55 to 45, notice we're just moving decades here. 32 texts, looks like a flourishing maybe, right? As if the community's growing even though the teacher's dead. But remember, we're in that 40-year period. And apocalyptic movements often grow as they approach the time of the end. And that 70 weeks prophecy that we go over in the course is so incredibly influential, because how could God be wrong? 70 weeks are determined, 10 jubilees, and the teacher came during the last jubilee, last 50 years. So everybody's starting to listen. And then 55 to 45, 32 texts that are extant. And Wise keeps making the point that, yeah, 32 are extant, but that's just what we happen to recover from the 10 caves. I say 10 because one of the caves didn't have any scrolls in it, even though we say there are 11 caves. So 32 texts, 9 old, look, you keep your old, 23 new texts. If you look at his appendix, he lists them all, you can just count them. 45 to 35, now we're getting down to the disappointing period. We get 81 texts, 32 old, so we keep the old, and 9 new. All of a sudden it's like, meh, I don't really want to write a lot of new stuff because prophecies failed, right? Now, I say prophecy fails, excuse me. Our interpretations of prophecy have failed, but they didn't say that. Remember? They did not say their interpretations failed. What did they say? They said God has extended the time. We were right, but now God has extended the time beyond anything that was written. And they quote Habakkuk, if it tarries, wait for it, it will surely come. So this is a very important point to make for apocalyptic history. Normally groups reset the date, reinterpret things to move it further on down, interpret it spiritually. Let's say, well, the end did come. Think of full preterist Christian Church of Christers today, primarily, originally, and now it's spread. Everything happened in 70. Say, well, what about the coming of Christ? Yeah, he came. The parousia, did the resurrection come? Yes. Some would say, yes, it did. They're in heaven right now. All those dead people went up to heaven. Or you just give up. You go, man, I'm not going to wait any longer for that. This group didn't say that. They said, we were right. There's no more knowledge of when it will come. It's a really convenient, irrefutable position to take. We were right, but God changed the time. And now we don't know what time we're on. I think I find that in Acts chapter 1, when the disciples say, keep this in mind, because where else are you going to find this strategy? The disciples say in Acts, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? So notice they still have the hope of the overthrow of the Romans and the setting up of the kingdom. So Eisman would like that verse. Restore the kingdom, the rule to Israel, not symbolically, not in heaven. And what does Jesus say in Acts? Not for you to know the times and the seasons, which are according to the Father's will, right? That I call the Qumran strategy. So we find it in the book of Acts. I think that's really fascinating because usually that's not the way. Now, in Sanhedrin, the Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 98, you can look it up online at Sepharia, Sefaria. That's the go-to source for all rabbinic texts, mystical texts, Talmuds, Jerusalem Talmud, Babylonian Talmud, Mishnah, Tosefta, Midrashim, Targums, all Jewish texts online. It's unbelievable, with commentary. What a resource. Nobody ever had this. Our generation has it. And what do you find? The rabbis come to the same conclusion. Some say, oh, I think it's this, and I think it's that. And finally, no more setting dates. It will come when it comes. And the great church finally largely took that position. Don't worry your head. Those things are in God's hands, and when they come, they will come. The main thing is your end is going to come when you die, and that could be any time. And the end of the cosmos, God's judgment could come anytime. So what's the lesson? Be ready anytime. Well, that's not the nature of apocalypticism. What does Paul say? Or a student of Paul, if you don't accept Thessalonians as fully by Paul. It's certainly partially by Paul. I think it's been interpolated. But Paul said that day cannot come unless first. It can't come unless first, and then the things he says that have to come first have never happened. So 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 is pretty tough to read unless you allegorize it and say, it doesn't really mean that. But the rabbis are basically saying, game's over, game's up, no more setting of dates. So all of this argues against Eisman, you can see, because he wants to move everything to here, and the flourishing of the text, the archaeological evidence, if you can accept the dating paleographically doesn't fit, but it doesn't mean the group didn't exist then. So that leads us to the idea that many of you suggested, and we've talked about in some of our meetings, that, well, maybe the group continues on and it gets picked up in different ways so that Jesus and James and John could all be Essenic or Essene types or Qumran types. And there's where I could agree with Eisman, but disagree with him because he wants to move the flourishing of the movement and the career of the teacher to the first century. And he wants to identify the teacher as James, the historical James, right? Who died, who was killed or murdered, brutally murdered, we think in the year 63. So let me talk about Eisman's work a little bit and how we might approach it, because it's very dense. And if you've worked through the course, you can handle it. But I want to give you a way to do a summary, okay? In 1984, this is before all the scrolls were released, he published Maccabees, Zadokites, Christians, and Qumran. And 2 years later, James the Just in the Habakkuk Pesher. Well, there the title is just like a thunderbolt. He's claiming that when the Habakkuk Pesher mentions the teacher, that's actually the James, the brother of Jesus. Very wisely in 1996, because everybody is now talking about him, and he was instrumental in releasing the scrolls. He puts them together. And this is the book to get, because he puts these two books together. He adds a very important introductory essay that basically, this is Eisman. When he talks, you get it all. He lays it all out, his whole theory, with all of its controversies. And it's kind of endearing to read if you know him, because you see his personality. You know, he's stormy, and then he's like so excited about what he's discovered. You know, he's got his enemies, but he's also got his great revelations to make at the same time. And then he adds essays and translations, and his translations are really good. But one of the essays he adds, because this was like his later discovery, the final proof that James and the righteous teacher are the same. See, you got to read that one. So if you can get the book, at least read that one. It's a great book to have. If you want to give time to Eisman, you got to have that book. James, the Brother of Jesus, is his most famous book. That's the book that won him acclaim, 1997. Most of us find that book very, very hard to read because of Eisman's writing style. And so one of his students did this, and he does an amazing work. It's printed in a really weird way, where it looks like you just took a Word document and ran the margins all the way to the edge where it wouldn't be too thick again. So this one is 400 pages, and it's the abridged edition. And I'm going to recommend those if you don't mind buying one more book. Neil Silberman is a great writer. I worked with him a lot when he was writing this. And he intended, this is when the Dead Sea Scrolls were just released. And it was so controversial in those days. You can follow Bar Magazine and so forth in the 90s. And some of that I covered in the course. So Silberman was determined to survey all of tell the whole story of the scrolls, how they were discovered, why they weren't released. And he finally called it Christianity, Judaism, and the War for the Dead Sea Scrolls. But I encouraged him to go spend time with Eisman. Just go talk to him. He became very sympathetic to Eisman's position because he finally understood it. What Eisman argues, that James the Just is the teacher. So you open up to Habakkuk Pesher and read about the teacher, that's James the Just. That is the brother of Jesus. And he thinks Paul is the liar. Okay. and the one who's teaching smooth things and opposing the truth. So it's a James and Paul dichotomy echoed in the Clementine literature. This is very much Eisman 101, our only reliable window to Jesus. Notice quotes, if he existed. You can know what James the Just was like by the letter of James, would be one source. Eusebius's church history, where he quotes Hegesippus and other sources, Epiphanius. The pseudo-Clementine literature, and in some cases, the Nag Hammadi texts, right? You can learn about James. So if you want to know about the teacher and about early Christianity and about Jesus, focus on James. Now, his argument would be that's what will give you the real flavor of what James is all about. So what does he say? That the early Dead Sea Scrolls scholars, they were Catholic. They thought, oh, Jewish monks. Wow, Jewish monks out in the desert. They're monastic, they're quietists, they're pacifists, they're contemplative. That's the model. And he would say, no, they're zealous for the Torah. They're messianic, apocalyptic, nationalistic. If you ask them what's the main thing that you want to see, it's that question in Acts. Will you at this time restore the kingdom of God to Israel? The restoration, the arrival of the kingdom of God on earth. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Daniel 9, Daniel 11. Overthrow of all opposition and the setting up of the kingdom of God. In contrast, he says Paul is pro-Roman, accommodationalist, pacifist, and Gentile-oriented. So he is the one who shapes what we know as Christianity. And then we read our Gospels to get Jesus through the lens of Paul. So if you're reading Mark, you're reading Paul, theologically speaking. Then you say, well, how do I know anything about James? Well, you've got the letter of James. It's only 5 chapters, but it's a start. And indeed, it does kind of shock you because it upholds the law and says whoever offends in one command is guilty of all. It sounds kind of like Matthew 5:17. Don't think I came to destroy the law, I came to fulfill. Lots of other things in James. Justification by faith is quoted, but not as a way that would be opposed to what's called works, the idea of works salvation. And of course, Eisman would say even the word works in English is misleading because it's ma'aseh. Remember MMT? Some ma'aseh of the Torah, some works of the law, meaning its interpretations of the Torah. And then you've got Eusebius quoting sources, mainly Hegesippus, where we know about his death and his martyrdom, but also quotes from Clement and other of the early 2nd century fathers who say when Jesus died, James was put in charge. And then you go like, what? I thought Peter was in charge. Peter's like the moderate, right? According to the book of Acts. But Acts doesn't really present a James that Eisman would accept. He would think that James was against Paul and Paul was against James and Paul resented James and that he has a different vision of things. And in the pseudo-Clementines, this material, you've got the recognitions and so forth. They're kind of complex, but it's basically some of these debates come out between a Paul-like figure and a Peter-like figure, one of which is supporting the Jerusalem church before 70, and the other, Paul, who's saying, I have late visions and revelations of the Lord and so forth. And then the Nag Hammadi texts. The Nag Hammadi texts aren't as useful because they've been overwritten with all kinds of Gnostic ideas. And they're more interested in the chthonic powers and the cosmic powers of the universe. But right in the Gospel of Thomas, what do you have? When I die, go to James the Just, right? It shows that there's something surviving, and April DeConnick has done the best work on that. If you want to study Gospel of Thomas as she understands it as coming from the Jerusalem church originally, not the version we now have in Coptic. Okay, so I'll stop the share and we'll try to put this together. Let me see my time. Okay. Try to give you 30 minutes here. And what we're going to do next time, whether you read Silverman or not, whether you want to try to get this book and read the introduction and maybe some of the essays, whether you want to get the little abridged book, this one is up to you. But I want to give you more time to soak in Eisman other than just the video in the light of what I'm going to say now. So let me say first, mainstream Dead Sea Scrolls scholars should read Eisman's work carefully. Forget about, is it first century BC or first century CE? I'm giving my view. Just forget that. Just talk about the ideas, the categories, and so forth. There's what is the group like? And he likes to call it, and excuse the word Palestine because today it has political meaning, but for scholars it doesn't. It just means the land of Israel. It means the Levant. What I learned from Eisman, and I still believe this, we're talking about the Messianic movement in Palestine, okay? And that is Jews and Jewish groups from the Maccabees down to the destruction of Jerusalem particularly, that believe the redemption is near, they're waiting for the Messiahs, they're zealous for the Torah, they can accept Gentiles. But anyway, you should read Eisman and forget the dating problem, just to get the ideas. And there I think he can be of real value. So let's say if I'm reading Eisman on the Habakkuk Pesher, I don't have to say, oh, that's James the Just in 63. I would move it to 63 BC more, or a little earlier than that if you go with Wise, because I think it fits the data, it fits the paleography, it fits the dating, it fits the history of ideas, and particularly Wise's thing about no first century characters are ever mentioned. How could you not mention Rome coming in 63? Yes, they took over, but then setting up Herod the Great as king of the Jews, you would never mention that in the scrolls. I mean, this is such a major, major event, right? You realize Augustus crowned Herod as king of the Jews and made him over a kingdom for 40 years, like King David, right? It's extraordinary. You say, the scrolls never bothered to mention that, but they're mentioning all the Maccabean kings and all the other rulers down to Pompey. Just doesn't make sense. And that part of it, I think, is valuable. And I did it in the course. What did I keep saying? If you want to study the Jesus movement, what is it? A messianic, apocalyptic, prepare the way in the wilderness. See, I don't have a problem. I think Jesus was all of those things. Now, halakhically means like the way you interpret Jewish law. I'm not convinced that James was not with the Jesus we see in the Gospels, that is, preaching a way that would make the burden light and the yoke easy. Because I find that even in John the Baptist. We only have little teeny snippets of John from Q mainly, and then what Jesus says about about John in Q. And he says he's more than a prophet. So he's exalting John. And even though their lifestyle in terms of eating bread and drinking wine was different. By the way, it doesn't say meat, it says eating bread and drinking wine. John apparently followed the Qumran rule that you only eat things that grow of themselves And we find that even in Slavonic Josephus. You don't want to go into the manufacturing, we call it today processed food. Have you ever known somebody that said, I don't eat processed food, I just eat food as it's produced by the earth? You can cook it and prepare it, but you don't change it into this other thing, like chocolate chip cookie doesn't grow on trees. You've created this new thing that'll probably make you sick and grow along and give you all kinds of problems, right? You get my example. So, but if Jesus is recorded to say in Q, among those born of women, there's none greater than John, and he's recorded to say that he's more than a prophet. And then we read in Thomas, go to James the just, for whom heaven and earth came to be. It's like, I want to take my Eisman with some dashes of salt, okay, but I'm not going to worry about arguing with him on dating. I'm more interested in the substance at this point. Now, when I read the early scrolls, I'm talking about Community Rule Damascus document and some of the K4 material, I find that there's a very strict tone in some of it that I find it hard to identify with in terms of some of the high level idealism that I see in other scrolls. Like when I read the Thanksgiving hymns, the devotion of that soul who wrote those hymns to God the Creator is so moving. So I wonder if, like the Pharisees, there was a kinder, gentler form of Phariseeism, about Hillel and Shammai. So I guess I'm kind of a Hillel Dead Sea Scroll guy, if you follow my crazy analogy, meaning if Jesus said, my yoke is easy and my burden is light, does he mean, oh, therefore you can break the law? Or does he mean, as we find in the so-called Sermon on the Mount, no, it actually makes it stricter, but based on what God really wants, not just arbitrary rules. In some of the K4 materials, there is a real concern with the level of ritual purity that it doesn't seem like Jesus would have cared for. But we assume then that John would have, but I'm not sure. And the one little scrap we have from John, he's preaching Jesus stuff. So could the Jesus movement be a version of Qumran type Judaism that is a kinder, gentler, more spiritually focused, but with still the basic expectations, prepare the way in the wilderness, the new covenant, and so forth. And then I would just see it as a further stage in the first century. And then James is like a successor to the teacher. But when I read the letter of James, which is all we have that's attributed to him, it's a beautiful letter. And I'm not going to say it fits Reform Judaism, because a lot of Reform Jews don't care what the Torah says. It's like, and I don't think that's true of James. I think he's concerned to keep the Torah, but to keep it how? And what we find in the Gospels, like Mark, is the Sabbath is made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath, and different kinds of injunctions like that. And that what goes into a person isn't what defiles, but what comes out of the heart. Now you think, well, that's really Christian. Thank God for that. No, that's actually very Jewish. So then Paul, very quickly, because my thing is Paul. I don't think Paul is the accommodating pro-Roman, anti-Jewish guy. My understanding of Paul on some of these issues is that he thinks the end is so near that so many things don't matter other than keeping order in a group that is full of Jews, non-Jews, slaves, free, rich, poor, men, women, and he's trying to amalgamate them all and basically says, don't ask questions, do what I say. So for example, here's Paul Let the women keep silent in all the assemblies, and they are not to speak. And if they have a question, they can ask their husbands at home. You go, rigid, rigid. I hate Paul. And then he says, but in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male or female, bond or free. We're all one. So Crossan would say, just for an example, and I don't know if Bart says this, I know I've heard Crossan say it. Well, that 1 Corinthians 14 passage is an interpolation. Paul never wrote that. That's just some zealous anti-feminist who hates women who put that in. I don't think so. It's in the context of order. All Paul wants to do is get everybody get along, you know. One guy only eat vegetables and another guy eats meat. One guy drinks wine, another guy doesn't drink wine. What does he say? Romans 14, let each one be persuaded in their own mind. To the Lord they give account, right? It's not that rigid. And he doesn't want his people being under the thumb of a strict Shammai type Pharisee for sure, because he grew up in that. And as he says, they just want to take your liberty away. But then Paul is very strict. He tells those young men at Thessalonica, you get a wife and quit committing fornication. And if you don't, the judgment of Jesus is going to come upon you. He says, the Lord will judge you. He's talking about the Lord Jesus Christ. And he believes in judgment against sin. He's strict. I mean, he really is. And what does he do in 1 Corinthians 6? If anybody is a brother and he's a liar and a thief and this and that, don't even eat with such a one. He doesn't think all the halakhic restrictions of the Shammai interpretation of the Pharisees. We forget there was Hillel and Shammai. Paul's after both of them. But it's like, think of two wings of a church today. One is more open and accommodating, and one is more strict and rigid. I grew up in a rigid Church of Christ, not even instrumental music. But the disciples of Christ across the road had the same Campbellite background, but they would let women participate and even lead prayers and do things. They weren't so rigid. But that's 2,000 years after the parousia didn't come. Are you going to keep enforcing things? So as I argue in Jesus and Paul, it's almost like you're in a boat and it's going to pull into harbor and everybody's fighting and disagreeing. And Paul's just saying, could you guys all just shut up? Here's some basic rules, allow a lot of freedom, and we're almost in the harbor and it's all going to be okay. First of all, you won't even be in the flesh anymore. So 99% of your questions will be over. Touch not, taste not, handle not, is this defiled? Is that? You won't even be discussing that anymore, right? Because it'll have nothing. These are bodily things. It's all going to be gone. And there's no temple, so all the ritual will go away. But Jesus already hinted at that. Mark 7, right? So I don't see Jesus and Paul as that different on that kind of thing. So I think scholars should read Eisman. I think he uncovers things that are very, very valuable about reading the scrolls. I think they were a radical, apocalyptic, messianic, prepare the way in the wilderness, thought the end was near, hoping for the redemption, believing it was coming, probably definitely within their lifetime. In the first century, it moves on through. We know they're still at Qumran. So I remember in a couple of our Zoom meetings, we were talking about the dark ages of the Dead Sea Scroll group. And for Eisman, the dark ages would be after Qumran, after it's destroyed and all. But for me, the dark age would be from Herod the Great on to the destruction of Jerusalem. I have no idea what those people out there were doing. They were there archaeologically. We have period 2. They're living there. But so when you say, what would it be like for Jesus to visit Qumran in the year 27? What if they would have welcomed him? Oh, we've heard about the good stuff you've been doing in the Galilee and all the preaching you're doing. Does a movement not change in 100 years, especially when some of their interpretations have fallen by the way?